They sent killers to silence him, but Traore turned assassination into revolution. It began on a silent Tuesday morning, the kind that smelled too clean to be real. Inside the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, guards moved with quiet precision, their boots polished, their rifles straight, their eyes sharper than usual. But something else had entered the air, something that did not belong. President IBRAHIM Traoré, Burkina Faso's youngest and most controversial leader, was sitting alone in his private war room, watching satellite feeds of the country's eastern border. His brow was furrowed, but not from the insurgents this time. It was the silence of his closest men that troubled him. Silence from men who once saluted too proudly, the kind of silence that felt like the moment before a gunshot. Unbeknownst to the nation, and even most within his Security Council, Traoré had received an anonymous message at midnight. A message left under his teacup by someone who knew the palace routes too well. A simple note. They will strike from within. Watch the eyes that salute you. That was all. No signature, no bluff. He hadn't told his ministers. He hadn't even alerted his intelligence director. Because in the African chessboard of post-colonial politics, betrayal never knocks. It smiles. By 10 a.m., 3 of his elite guards had already switched shifts unexpectedly. 2 others, normally stationed near the rear gate, were reassigned to interior detail. No one asked why. That was the first red flag. The second came when a junior guard named Musa, usually stationed far from the president's private corridor, entered with a tray of morning millet porridge, flanked by another soldier who never spoke. Traoré's fingers hovered above the bowl. He didn't touch it. Instead, he stared directly into Musa's eyes. "Do you eat before serving the commander-in-chief?" he asked softly. Musa blinked, swallowed hard, said nothing. The silent soldier next to him coughed and reached into his jacket. That was the moment the floor cracked beneath the nation's trust. With a thunderous roar, Traoré's desk flipped sideways, a hidden steel plate rising between him and the would-be assassin. Musa dropped the tray. A needle of black poison darted from the silent soldier's hand. Embedded in the steel wall where Traoré's chest had been seconds ago, alarms didn't go off. The palace was never designed for betrayal from the inside, but Traoré was. He moved like a panther through the corridor, eyes cold, jaw tight, as his loyal intelligence unit hidden beneath civilian clothing sprang from behind mirrored walls. 3 guards were captured. 1 was shot dead after drawing a pistol. The silent one was the first to talk, and what he said nearly brought Traoré to his knees. "It wasn't just us," he whispered. "Your vice president knows. The Americans know. The deal with Niger, it was never supposed to happen." In the silence that followed, the weight of sovereignty pressed against Traoré's ribs, because the palace had always been under threat. But never from this close. News of the assassination attempt never reached the press. The bodies were cleaned, the footage erased, and the soldiers' families were told they had died in an off-site training accident. But inside the palace, IBRAHIM Traoré was not the same man anymore. His silence became heavier, his eyes more calculating. Something sacred had been broken, not by the bullets, but by the betrayal. For months, Traoré had suspected external pressure creeping into his administration like termites under polished wood. Foreign advisors pushing contracts, military training proposals from embassies that arrived too quickly, diplomats smiling too often. But now the lines were clearer. This wasn't just a palace plot. It was a geopolitical ambush. The man who confessed, the mute soldier with the poisoned dart, was later found hanging in his cell. Official reports called it suicide. Traoré knew better. No one in his custody had ever escaped oversight. This was a message, one from outside. He summoned his most trusted intelligence chief, Colonel Adama Diallo, a man whose loyalty had been tested in the bush, not in a conference room. "They think we don't understand their script," Traoré said quietly, staring at the floor. "They think Africa will always trade gold for safety." Colonel Diallo nodded. "But they didn't plan for you." "No one did." Traore began shifting his internal cabinet that week, slowly, quietly. Every minister was reviewed, every foreign bank transaction traced. His vice president, a polished man with a smooth French education and soft palms, was moved to a ceremonial role, officially to focus on youth development. Unofficially, he was under house arrest. Then came the message from Washington, a subtle, perfectly worded diplomatic warning. We are concerned about recent shifts in power within Burkina Faso and advise against authoritarian restructuring. America values democratic stability. But it wasn't about democracy. It was about lithium. 3 weeks before the assassination attempt, Traore had refused a U.S.-backed mining contract, one that would have handed over 60% of Burkina Faso's rare earth mineral rights for 30 years. Instead, he signed a silent memorandum with a lesser-known Russian-African trade bloc, granting local cooperatives the first rights to mining, under full Burkinabe oversight. The West wasn't ready for that. By the time Part 2 of the plan unfolded, the trap was already reset. A second strike came, not with bullets, but with rumors. Western outlets began spinning headlines. Burkina Faso drifts toward authoritarianism under Traore. Concerns grow over press freedoms. Traore's regime accused of human rights violations. The International Court was summoned to review his record. Sanctions were whispered in closed-door meetings. But Traore remained silent until the leaked audio, a voice memo, crackling but clear, surfaced from within the U.S. State Department. In it, a former diplomat discussed a clean swap, removing Traore in favor of a more compliant leader through military reshuffling. The tape spread across the Sahel like wildfire. The people rose before Traore even called. Men marched through. Cities holding signs that read, "You touch one of us, you touch us all." Women wore scarves stitched with his face. The villages lit torches, not in protest, but in protection. And somewhere in the dark, Traore smiled. Because while they plotted with soldiers, he had armored himself with the hearts of the people, but the next strike would be louder. It would not come through poison or whispers. It would come through a press conference broadcast live to the world. The room was small by presidential standards. No flags, no podium, just a wooden chair and a single camera. That was all Traore requested. No glamour, no handlers, only truth. The world had been watching Burkina Faso with growing suspicion. Foreign media had painted him as a strongman. Western analysts debated whether he would last the year. Behind closed doors, diplomats whispered about his instability, but none of them knew what was coming. The broadcast went live at 7:00 p.m. GMT. No introductions, no background music. Just Traore, wearing a plain brown shirt, seated with his hands resting on his knees. His eyes, sharp, unwavering, looked directly into the camera. He didn't speak like a politician. He spoke like a soldier. Last month, he began, "My own bodyguard was paid to poison me." The sentence dropped like thunder over a silent savannah. I survived, but not because I was lucky. I survived because I no longer eat from the plates you offer. The world froze. What followed was not just a confession. It was an indictment. Traore revealed timelines, documents, financial trails. He spoke of the mining contracts foreign nations tried to force. He played segments of the leaked tape. He listed companies. He named nations. And then he said the one sentence that lit the Sahel on fire. This is not just about me. This is about the last breath of colonial control hiding inside our own palaces. For the first time in modern African history, a sitting president had declared psychological war, not just on those who tried to kill him, but on the systems that allowed them to try. Immediately after the broadcast, embassies across West Africa scrambled to respond. News anchors stammered. Think tanks rushed out statements. Some called it dangerous populism. Others whispered, he might have just changed history. But the retaliation came quickly. An emergency summit was called in Geneva. International economic agencies began discussions to freeze assets linked to the Burkinabe government. Aid packages were reviewed. NATO requested intelligence updates, and then, something no one expected. A U.S. senator, anonymous at first, leaked a private transcript from a high-level military liaison, admitting that American advisors had been embedded in West Africa under the guise of counterterrorism, but had taken meetings with opposition figures inside Burkina Faso. Traore was vindicated, but it was also a death sentence. By now, he was not just a target of greedy contractors, he was a symbol, a storm that could spread to Mali, Niger, Guinea, and beyond. Inside the palace, Colonel Diallo presented him with satellite photos of unusual activity near the northern border. 2 foreign helicopters had landed in unmarked zones. There were signs of private military contractors, possibly imported to create chaos that would justify intervention. Traore stood quietly and stared out the window. "They will come as friends again," he said, "with new faces and new flags. But their mission is old." He turned back to Diallo. "Let them come. But this time, we are not just ready, we are watching." Across the country, digital billboards now flashed a single slogan. They planned the palace, we planned the people. At exactly 3:37 a.m., under cover of darkness, 5 black SUVs crossed the Burkinabe border, disguised as humanitarian aid vehicles. But inside, there were no doctors, no medicine, only men trained to remove heads of state without leaving fingerprints. They weren't official U.S. military. That would have been too obvious. These were contractors, deniable assets, recruited through third-party firms, tasked with one job: neutralize President IBRAHIM Traoré and install a provisional leader backed by foreign intelligence. But they didn't know the soil they had entered had changed. As the vehicles approached the capital, satellites blinked. Out, cut off by a new national cybersecurity unit built silently with help from Pan-African allies. Traffic signals rerouted. Checkpoints turned into ambushes. By the time the third vehicle reached the inner circle of the city, it exploded into flames, detonated by a roadside transmitter no bigger than a cigarette box. Only one vehicle made it to the palace gates, and even then, it was welcomed. The 5 men inside stepped out, confused, facing what seemed like an open door. They moved forward, cautious, weapons drawn. But inside the courtyard they found themselves surrounded, not by guards but by hundreds of villagers, elders, mothers, students, minors, unarmed, silent, forming a wall of human defiance between the world and their leader. A voice from the rooftop rang through the courtyard. "If you wish to kill me, you will have to kill the nation." It was Traore, not hiding, not protected, standing above them all, his chest bare. His arms raised, not in surrender, but in truth. The contractors didn't fire, they didn't have the order, and even if they did, they saw something they hadn't been told about. The people. The plan had failed before the bullet left the chamber. Because it wasn't just an assassination attempt anymore. It was a confrontation with a new Africa, one that had read its own history, grieved, and stood back up. By dawn, the contractors were gone. Traore had them escorted to the border, unharmed but exposed. Within hours, the footage of their capture and silent release flooded international screens. It was a message, not of revenge, but of restraint. Strength not used is louder than blood. In Washington, panic turned to denial. "We had no involvement," a press secretary said, but few believed it. The African Union held a historic emergency session. For the first time, they spoke not just of resolutions, but of realignment. Burkina Faso was no longer seen as fragile. It was a blueprint. In the weeks that followed, mining contracts across the Sahel were renegotiated. Military bases faced public audits. Civilian militias were replaced by new civic councils led by teachers, nurses, and veterans. Not all perfect, but real. And Traore, he remained. Not untouched, not infallible, but standing, because while they had plotted inside the palace walls, he had armored himself with something no foreign power could penetrate, a nation that had finally seen itself, and refused to be unseen. Surviving an assassination doesn't end the war, it changes the battlefield. Weeks after the failed palace strike, IBRAHIM Traoré sat alone in his private quarters, reading the intelligence updates. They weren't reports anymore. They were warnings. Mali was being destabilized. Guinea was on alert. Togo had just discovered foreign funds pouring into unknown NGOs. The pattern was spreading. This wasn't about one president now. It was about silencing a movement. What Traoré had ignited, consciously or not, was an ideological wildfire. A vision of Africa that stood up, not with weapons alone, but with dignity. But dignity had a cost. That night a courier arrived. No escort, no voice. Just a small black envelope, sealed in wax with a European crest. Inside, a letter, unsigned, offering retirement in dignity. A quiet life in a villa. A foreign passport. A promise. No more interference in West African affairs. Just walk away. Traoré folded the letter, lit a match, and watched it burn in silence. The next morning his convoy was struck near a rural bridge. A landmine detonated under the third vehicle, killing 2 guards instantly. It was the first public blood. Of the ongoing shadow war, Traoré survived again, but something changed. He didn't return to the palace that night. Instead, he flew, covertly north, to a tiny rural village called Kuni. Population, 1,400. No media, no signal towers, just red earth and ancestral pride. At the center of the village, under an ancient baobab tree, he met with 13 traditional kings, spiritual elders who had ruled the land long before colonizers drew borders. They did not greet him as a president. They greeted him as a warrior who had stepped into sacred fire and emerged with truth. One of them, King Were of the Mossy people, placed a carved wooden spear at his feet. "You will not win by bullets," he said. "You will win by belonging." That night, a new force was born. Not military, not political, but cultural. Elders across villages began calling it the Earth Council. Their mission: protect the soul of the land from being sold, regardless of which president signed the papers. Back. In the capital, global pressure intensified. Bank accounts froze. French media ran pieces calling Traoré dangerously radical. American think tanks published profiles labeling him a risk to stability, but Traoré never responded with speeches. He responded with a school built from local clay, powered by solar, named after Thomas Sankara. Open to all. Free to children of farmers, soldiers, and even his critics. When asked why, he simply said, "They gave us weapons. We gave them children who can read." But the enemies weren't done. They didn't just want to remove Traoré now. They wanted to erase what he symbolized. It started with a rumor, a false report that Traoré had fled to Russia, that he had abandoned the presidency. Western media picked it up instantly. Headlines declared chaos. The Burkinabe currency plummeted overnight. Foreign embassies evacuated. But at 6 a.m. the next day, the president's voice returned, not through press but through village loudspeakers. From Kuni to Kaya to Bobo Dioulasso, old radio systems crackled alive. I did not run. I walked into the dust of my ancestors. I stood on the ground they bled for. I'm still standing. It wasn't a speech. It was a resurrection. Traoré's advisors begged him to fly to Addis Ababa and address the African Union in person. But he refused. Instead, he issued an invitation. A Pan-African summit, not in a hotel, not in a capital, but under the baobab trees of Burkina Faso. And they came. Not all presidents. Some sent generals, some sent scholars. A few sent nothing but silence. But those who came witnessed something never seen before. Traoré sat at the center of a dirt circle. Around him, kings, farmers, revolutionaries, and ministers. No translator. No microphone. Just listening. Just truth. And then a boy, barefoot, dusty, no more than 10, stepped forward with a small clay bowl. He handed it to Traoré and said, "This is all we have, but it is yours." Traoré bent down, took the bowl, and whispered, "Then this is the treasure the world tried to steal." He held it up before the circle. And that image, a president kneeling before a child with a clay bowl, became the new face of African power. Not clenched fists, not gold-plated thrones, just quiet defiance and sacred humility. By nightfall, whispers had already reached foreign capitals. The assassination failed. Now the idea has become immortal.